right?
Very, yeah, very much so. No, there's some great stuff by philosopher Bernard Williams on
Mm,
immortality, as I
mm,
recollect, that
mm,
that kind of it draws up some interesting identity questions. Because if you have
mm,
a kind of psychological notion of an identity condition, then yeah, I mean, you might think that the biological entity that I am can be kept immortal indefinitely, and I can keep those processes going, but if you're committed to the psychological identity, then it gets more tenuous, I think,
mm.
or
Yeah.
at least there are good reasons to think it's tenuous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just think we should be really careful about assuming that, about 100 years is great, but otherwise too much, because it's all relative, right? You could imagine a species like us that lives kind of like an octopus, really smart, but lives very short. And
Yeah.
to them, like, you guys live 100 years, that's crazy. Nobody could stay sane for 100 years. So I don't know. Maybe we're being chauvinistic, or maybe not. I don't know.
No, I think that absolutely makes sense. But I think about somebody like Parfit, right, who says that, oh yeah, I think my identity over my lifetime is stable and consistent. But he would actually argue, right, that we have like my sense of values and the things that I hold and everything else are just entirely different than 3-year-old me. So he would say I'm actually just an entirely different person than I was
Mm.
at 3, and that my identity shifts even over the course of our lifetimes. It's not stable enough to point at one consistent thing that's there. So kind of, if you construe it in that kind of looser sense, then again the biological thing is stable enough to point at, I think, a single trajectory. But yeah, if the psychological identity, it gets tricky. But I think that in the biological, I've a little bit, Dan, you've read some of my stuff. I've kind of been really interested in immortal cell lines and kind of looked at
Uh-huh.
the tracking identity through those over time, and kind of some of the interesting stuff that you get into when you look at cell division and whatnot there. Though I guess some of the latest stuff suggests that there isn't truly symmetrical division among cells. But I don't know. You would perhaps know more about that than I do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. Even the biological version, right? So the kind of caterpillar butterfly thing. I forget who it was, maybe Simak or Asimov or somebody. But there was a science fiction story a long time ago where they got life extension just a little bit. It wasn't much, but people were living to like 130 year, something like that. But that was enough to get them over a hump where they would start transforming into whatever the next developmental stage is. And it's just that nobody had ever noticed it because nobody made it. Nobody lived that long. But once you
Right.
once you get to it, and they were, I forget what they were doing, growing wings or something. I forget. But so even
I love
even
that.
right, even developmentally, like if we did have longer biologically, who knows what further. I mean, we study this all the time in terms of, you got these bioelectric pre-patterns that kind of get you to adulthood, but then what, right? And maybe if you were to prevent them from degrading, which is what happens during aging, I think, maybe there's more transformation down the line, and maybe more stuff would happen biologically. I think we don't know. But the cell line, the other interesting thing about the cell line stuff is, with the anthrobots, right? So we've made these anthrobots out of from cells get donated by adult human donors. Maybe many of these donors are very elderly, and by the time we make these anthrobots, they may or may not still be around, but the bots are around and they're running around and doing interesting things. And that's like kind of like the cell lines, but even more so, because unlike the cell lines, these guys, you can test them for behavior. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, for example, you get this, we get a sheet on the donor, right? So this was a, white male, this, that, or the other thing. So some of them are smokers. So now my question is, do the anthrobots seek out nicotine? And if they do, what else that we don't know how to test for is being propagated from the donor, right? We know information moves through the body, and in the planaria anyway, it moves from in and out of the brain pretty readily. So who knows, right? And then that's a whole other set of philosophical identity issues if it turns out that these bots are carrying some behavioral traits.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That would be super fascinating if you could kind of track, yeah, behavioral traits that have been passed along like that, and then
Yeah.
track how long they maintain. And yeah, that would be absolutely.
Following up on your caterpillar butterfly thing, there's some bioelectric field or set of fields more likely that are decaying over time as we age, right?
Yep.
Are there any fields that are just coming, that are just developing, that are headed in the other direction, that are forming as we age? Because that would suggest that we're a larval stage in some,
Yep.
or an earlier stage in something longer than that. These
Yep.
fields are developing on different time scales, right?
Yep. Yeah. We don't know because whole body imaging is still extremely hard, even in small model systems. So we have snapshots of specific stages in frog and planaria and things like that.
Mm.
We have hardly anything in human. We have certainly not good sort of
Yeah.
timelines like that. But we're working on those technologies. So I think that will exist. And I don't, I think it's completely possible. I think the conventional suggestion would be that that probably isn't going to happen, because if that didn't exist as an evolutionary history, then
Mm.
because there's all these theories of disposable bodies
Well,
once, but I don't.
hen's teeth and horse's toes. It could
Yeah, yeah,
the formulas could be in there and serving other purposes as well,
yep.
which could maintain them evolutionarily. We're just having fun here anyway. I'm sure it's not like that. Uh,
I don't
Tell
know.
me, in the tadpole, are there adult frog bioelectric fields that are measurable and changing in documentable ways?
Sure, sure, sure.
Is
Yeah,
the adult active during the tadpole stage? It's just invisible.
it's absolutely, yeah. Adult animals absolutely have them. The question is, what are they doing? And so the evidence from the functional evidence from the adult data is that they're operating in cancer suppression, they're
Mm,
operating in wound healing, they're operating
mm,
in like local tissue maintenance. It's
yeah,
unclear whether they're doing the same very large scale instruction the way that they are in development. But
yeah,
for example, it is known. So if you take in a rat and you denervate, like cut the lingual nerve, the rosettes on the tongue, the papillae, histologically they fall apart, they become disorganized. So that suggests that you need, now that happens to be neural. I think the vast majority of it is probably not neural, but the point is it needs constant upkeep,
okay,
and that's a multi-cell type tissue histology kind of thing.
yeah,
So I wouldn't be surprised at all if these things were actually, and that's one of our hypotheses in our aging regeneration program here, is that what's happening is that with age those patterns become fuzzier. They sort of
yeah,
degrade and it becomes harder, and they sort of scale down to the point where you're just trying to keep individual cells identity, but the tissue is starting to not
yeah,
have that precise pattern. So yeah, but they're absolutely measurable, and they do have tissue level roles.
right. So I have a one item on my agenda with you.
Go for it. Let's do it.
And I have to make sure this doesn't come out as garbage. So let me look at what I wrote here.
And then I have
So go.
one item agenda after, but you go, Dan.
Oh, okay. You want to go first? That's
Oh no,
fine.
no, you go, you go.
Okay. So your notion of encoding of goals, I both like and dislike that language. I dislike it because it's the language of machines, and we want to get away from machine metaphors. On the other hand, if you're going to reach people who already have machine metaphors in their heads and communicate with them, it sure helps to use their language. So encoding of goals, I think I know it's a top-down kind of thing. It's totally consistent with our view of field theory, of how fields govern lower level things within them. We've got a lot to agree about there. One, not roadblock, but one issue for us is how human motivation is encoded. And the first pass at this, the first thought about it would be that it's going to be neurally encoded, that there's going to be some large scale pattern of neural activation that forms the higher level field in our terms, that governs lower level neural activity, like, moving and thinking and talking. Um, First, is this way of thinking about it consistent with yours? And then, do you know anything about these neural fields?
Yeah. let's see. Okay, let's talk about that, the human case first. So I think Earl Miller at MIT has done some of the most amazing recent work on that topic. Now, his is mostly for memory and other aspects of behavior. I'm not sure he covers goals specifically, but
Yep.
absolutely, he's been a pioneer in really talking about how the field as the actual field of the neuronal network, not the individual neuronal states, but the field is critical for behavior. And so you probably want to take a look at that. I think it's fantastic stuff, and we're using a lot of it as an inspiration to look for that outside the brain.
So the name again was the MIT guy?
Miller,
Earl Miller, I've got it.
Earl, yeah, yeah, Earl
Earl
Miller,
Miller.
yeah,
Got it.
Miller, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
really high, like state of the art neuroscience. But so I think that's perfectly reasonable. The other thing, like, yes, I think that's quite likely. The other thing I would add to that is, to the extent that goal mechanisms in the human brain are dependent on memory mechanisms, I think
Mm.
that this is, the substrate of memory is a very contentious topic still, and there's been a bunch of conferences and lots of people recently kind of putting cracks in this idea that it's the classic story of synaptic, that it's all in synaptic plasticity. And so,
Yeah.
right. And so if that's the case, Glantzman had an amazing conference recently that covered a lot of this stuff at UCLA. And if that's the case, then yes, you've got the field and those kinds of things, but you also have subcellular substrates that, whether they be cytoskeleton, some people are into RNA, as the basis of memories. There's going to be that multi-scale thing going on, right? Where and my conjecture on all of this is that I don't think there is one mechanism of memory. I think that basically what the nervous system is doing is using all kinds of things in the cell as a reservoir, and then
Mm.
it's interpreting that what the neurons are for interpreting the information that's there, and confabulating about it because it doesn't, it can't have the ground truth. So yeah, but I agree with you that the field is actually a really important top down controller.
Just to clarify what you just said, when we get down to the subcellular level, whether it's synapses or whether it's intracellular chemistry or cytoskeleton, whatever it is, the memory can't be there. Memory of my cat when I was a kid, there's no cats down in those cells. Nothing cat-like, nothing cat image-like. What there is a pattern of interaction, right, with that cell and other cells based on their subcellular machinery. And that higher level pattern constitutes the memory. Yes or
I
no?
agree with you. Yes, I completely agree with you. And I further have been recently looking into the notion of the idea that all of those things are basically messages, those engrams, whatever the encoded medium is, are basically messages from your past self, that
Mm.
in order to decode them, you need a creative process, because the squeezing down of rich experience into some kind of compressed representation where you throw away all the
Mm.
all the correlations and everything, you get this like compressed engram. Decoding it again later is a creative process, because you don't know what it meant before. You have to do your best to
Yeah,
guess, right? And
right.
so yeah, and so I think it's a constant construction, and the butterfly caterpillar gives a kind of the drastic version of that. But for all of us, I think we're constantly reconstructing from the evidence that has been left in these subcellular
Right. So all that
processes.
makes sense, but let me pursue it another step further. If I were to pluck out one given cell that's involved, whose subcellular machinery is involved in the memory of my cat somehow, pluck it out, there's nothing I could do to that cell, no experiment I could do that would derive the notion of my cat from it, because I need thousands or millions of those cells with their subcellular machineries programmed in the right way, in order to get the cat idea.
I understand why you're saying that, and that may well be true, but I am not 100% sure that's true. And the reason I'm not sure
Ah,
that's true, and I
interesting.
don't have a brilliant theory of how it would be otherwise. So I totally know why you're saying this. Like, it makes sense,
Yeah.
but we've had a number of examples where um, very small pieces of tissue transplanted from one animal to another. And most of this, by the way, is not classic behavior. This is behavior in more in anatomical space. So it could be that that doesn't hold. It would, maybe.
Yeah.
But one thing that we see is that very small pieces from one animal of one state into another tend to carry across and actually not only become interpreted correctly, but actually push the whole host in a completely different direction. And I
Yeah.
think, I don't know why that is, but I think it has something to do with amplification of novelty. When you get new information, that it's sort of the flip side of the surprise minimization. Like on the one hand, you want to minimize surprise. On the other hand, you don't want to you need to explore too, right? So when you get information that suddenly doesn't agree with the rest of the body, you might want to take that seriously. Something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that even across, and so this is why we want to do things like this anthropobot, right? So I want to so here was a human whose neurons were adapted to nicotine, and then now you've made anthrobots. Anthrobots have no neurons. They're entirely skin epithelial, tracheal epithelium. So if they still have the behavior, that means that it's crossed over, right, from that neural, and we don't have these data yet. So who knows how this will turn out. But other people have done things, cross species memory transplants, and in Planaria you can do tail to brain and things like that. So I don't know. I don't know how much, if the information really is, if the engrams really are, for example, cytoskeletal states, maybe the interpretation machinery doesn't have to be tons of neurons. Maybe it can be a lot of the molecular networks inside of a single cell, such that maybe you get quite a bit already.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay, it runs against the grain of my thinking, but that doesn't make it false. So
yeah, and I think we don't, I don't know. I think it's more. I think what you said is more probable, but I'm just not sure that it has to be that way.
So the basic notion that there are processes for encoding things at lower levels has to be right, because that's where that's how DNA serves as a memory molecule. Natural selection over a gazillion years takes all this dynamical function and encodes it somehow over time into this stone cold dead molecule, DNA, and so it can be extracted by the same dynamical processes when they come along. So we know this encoding at a lower level works. It's just that things like behavior, which seem to be operating at a high scale, dynamically operating at a high scale, there hasn't been evolutionary time to encode love of nicotine. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean there aren't processes for doing it overnight, for all I know. It'd just be weird if there were.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I think a couple of things there. One is that, and we should go back and talk about the goal encoding thing too, because I'm interested in your thoughts on this. We see so first of all, behavior, like I expand that to behavior in other spaces. So for example, behavior in anatomical space, behavior in transcriptional space, right, in physiological state space, and in those spaces we also see incredible plasticity and ability to solve problems that you have not seen evolutionarily before, right? So you've got this like evolution produces these problem-solving agents that can solve problems in different spaces. And I think it's a hugely interesting and important question, is for really novel for novel agents like synthetic biobots, like chimeras, hybrids, all that kind of stuff, where their goals come from. Because in that case, you don't have eons of selection to lean on for a specific for a specific goal, or any of the kind of really out of the box novelty that we see them accommodating to. I don't say adapting. It doesn't take generations.
So the selection in the past produces all these dynamical processes with enormous capabilities, many of which are never realized in their time. Insects have the capability to generate an extra leg pair. Hell, where'd that come from, right? But leg pairs had to be selected at one point or another. And so there are these modules built into the system that can be invoked in novel contexts and do wildly different things. You can get legs on your head if you're a fruit fly, right? Um, so what you just said is, I think, is totally consistent with some sort of combination of selection embedding capabilities, and those capabilities being deployed in wildly different contexts in overnight, in a matter of minutes and hours, to produce new sorts of behaviors. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah. I think so I take it a little bit even further. I mean, everything, I agree with all of that, like
Yeah,
recombination of past modules, and in new ways like that absolutely is a
yeah.
part of it. But I think we see them and doing new things that I think there's more to it than reuse of modules that you've
Huh.
had before.
Okay.
I think really we're seeing behaviors that I don't think ever existed before, and you can decompose it. Well, the pieces of it did, but eventually, if you keep going, you just sort of shade into right. That's a completely novel reuse of physics that has all. I mean, the physics, right? I think eventually you just end up bumping into two things: physics and in general these kind of like wherever the laws of
Mhm.
mathematics come from. These
Yeah.
very basic things. Those things are absolutely being reused, but these modules get smaller and smaller when you get weirder and weirder in terms of the perturbations that you're doing to these things.
So tell me if the following story is along the lines you're talking. It could be wildly off base, and don't be afraid to tell me that. I did some work with a behavior guy, human evolution guy, interested in primatology and so on, and he thinks that one of the bases of civilization and the success of human beings is our ability to recognize when interactions are working.
Mm.
So you and I carrying a couch upstairs, we've never done it before. It falls all over the place. We hurt ourselves. Finally, we find a pattern with you in front, me in back, turning it on its side, where as it's happening in the moment, we have a module that just says, shit, this is working, right? And so what we come up with, the behavior we come up with to actually get the couch upstairs is completely novel. There was no module for twisting large things in 3 dimensions at all. There's
Mhm.
just a this is working module.
Yep.
So if you pitch these modules at a high enough level of generality, I think you'll get a lot of what you see out of it, and it'll look just miraculous from the outside.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's right, but I think that begins at the microbial level. So,
Yes.
right, so we see
Yeah.
this kind of like generic stress response that tells you
Yeah.
how are we doing? Is this working? Is this not working?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's this generic stress response that starts extremely early on, and it starts around things like protein folding and DNA damage, and these very tiny things. And then evolution apparently scaled it up, and this is a bunch of stuff that isn't published yet that'll come out hopefully this year, where what evolution is doing is reusing some of those same loops, but it's in the so this loop like measure where we are, compare it to where you want it to be, and then the stress is proportional to the error, and then you try to adjust, right? This
Yep.
kind of like
Yep.
homeostatic thing.
Yep.
So what I think evolution's able to do is to replace the wild cards in that basic loop. Like, what do we measure? What do we remember? You can put whatever you want, and the loop still works. And so it seems to be reusing a lot of those same things for very high level stuff, like how many eyes do we have, how what
Yeah.
is our primary axis like, and then
Yeah.
keeps going, and you can do the couch moving and everything else. But I agree
Yeah.
with you. I think that basic feedback of stress is driving a lot of this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
which allows you to do some crazy experiments. For example, you can use anxiolytics on, because you can cut that loop. You can cut the loop with anxiolytic drugs, and you can say, what, measure the error, but don't worry about it. If the error is high, meh, it doesn't matter. And so if you do that, you can do that with embryos. You can do that with regenerating organs. You can do that with cells. You get some very interesting results when you decouple. When you lower their you lower the effort that they put in reducing error. It becomes very
Yeah.
interesting.
So
Decreasing tolerances as a route to novelty.
Yep. Yep.
I want to jump in and ask what forgive me if this is just an incredibly obvious question, but when something's working, because it seems like when you set kind of the expectation of the goal or what something's driving towards or a system there, when it's working, still seems to be measured in terms of kind of survivability or fitness success, which works on the lower scale stuff. But once you get up to the couch, it's not necessarily going to be working at that level, right? If that
The
makes sense.
Sorry, say that again.
evolutionary, yeah, go ahead, say it again.
Well, so if right regeneration increases something's fitness, you get a certain cycle, and then I can kind of evaluate whether or not a process is working or not, kind of on the basis of whether or not it's helping achieve fitness goals. Then I'm kind of using the same, measurement scale of a natural selection process or something like that. But once you get up to the goal of getting a couch upstairs, right there, it's unclear whether or not that's in fact increasing my fitness. So it seems like we're somewhere there's we're conflating something that's happening in those processes, because the story that I tell down there, it seems like the goal or what I'm using to evaluate whether or not a system's working is just entirely different than it's going to be for other questions that I might ask at kind of higher level processes.
So I'll
Or
throw
am I?
in the story that I just told you, this this is working module, if there is such a thing, or a general capability, is hypothesized to have evolved in early primates as a way of doing collaborative hunting, where one individual goes after the prey, it doesn't work. Two of them go after it chaotically, it only sort of works. Five of them go after it, well, it works a little bit. And whoa, three circle around from the front, three from the back. And there's some recognition of the fact that we're getting disproportionate returns on our labor here. Selection never envisioned that actual strategy of coming around from the front and coming around from the back of the prey animal. It's not wired in there. What is wired in there is the recognition strategy that some collaboration is producing results that are close to the target. Does that make sense?
That afford a selective advantage.
Well, yeah, but the whole process, it has a selective advantage. The recognition has a selective advantage, but how the recognition plays out, producing this strategy, which is inherited from one primate tribe to the next, right? This strategy of encirclement of prey was never wired in there, and will never be wired in there. It's just social collaboration working to produce a goal is what's wired in there.
Yeah, I think that
Michael, jump in.
yeah, and I think that makes sense. I always want to step back and try to reflect on when we evaluate a process or a system as working versus not, and how
Yeah.
the evaluation's being done. Because it seems like it's easy to there. I think slippage there sometimes, not necessarily,
Huh. Interesting.
but right. So I
Yeah.
I mean, I understand the discipline. This is, for example, Dan Dennett was always very strong on this. Is the discipline to try to put everything in the evolutionary from the evolutionary point of view, and I think there's great use to that. But I don't think it's the only way to
Yeah.
see goals or working or any of that. I think it's one perspective. So I think as Dan was saying, I think that what is incredibly advantageous is problem solving in various guises, and for example, the kind of thing he was
Mhm.
just describing, but various other ways. And things, individual instances of it may not themselves be widely applicable or adaptive, but the capacity to do it, which then plays out in different ways. So like one of the things that people are seeing now, for example, is, have you seen this stuff on the thanatotranscriptome? You seen this stuff? So
uh,
so so basically, it's pretty cool. Basically, what happens is that when animals or even human patients die, as the body dies, the individual cells, most of whom are perfectly fine, are turning on a whole bunch of new genes. And so this is called the thanatotranscriptome. It's a set of genes that are turned on, and so it's not the same as, well, transcription goes down because the cells are deprived of oxygen or whatever. This is a very active, energetic process. They're actually turning on new genes. And one way to think about it is, in the case of In the case of the human, or a mammal or a bird living in dry air, that's a dead end. That's not going anywhere. These cells are not. There is no second life for these cells. But in weird scenarios, for example, in our anthrobots, the collective, and in fact in the xenobots, right? So to make a xenobot, the original embryo may no longer be around because you've dissociated into cells. So the original embryo has died, but the cells have not. And the fact that they can turn on new genes, and in fact they turn on hundreds of new genes that normal embryos don't have, and they have a new life doing new things like kinematic self-replication that never, like as far as we know, no other animal does this. They can in fact have a new life. Now, has that ever been, has selection ever seen that particular thing? I'm not sure that it ever has, and I'm not sure that that in itself, especially in a mammal, would be of any use. But the general ability to, okay, we're in a different scenario now, and we need to figure out how to get along in some new anatomical configuration, some new environment. That, I think, it was true from day one, because you can't really count on, never mind the environment, but you can't even really count on your morphology being the same generation to generation, right? And this is that plasticity. This is why, like another thing, about the kidney tubules in the salamander, right? So that kind of crazy thing, you can't, coming into the world, you're a newt. You don't know how many copies of your genome you're going to have. You don't know what your cell size is going to be. You don't know how many cells. You can't assume any of that. You just have to figure out how you're gonna survive in whatever internal and external affordances you've got. So I think that's incredibly adaptive, and that is what evolution is aiming for. But then the individual instances of it will be like the humans. You try all kinds of stuff. Some of it helps, and some of it doesn't.
Okay. Yeah. And that is.
Are these cells going protist? Are they turning on the ancient protist machinery, thinking all the external constraints are gone? I'm not part of a multicellular anymore. The signals coming in from the larger gradients are fading. Shit, I'm a protist. Let's do this.
So they actually are, and this will be we'll be pre-printing this in the next week or two. Yes, they are, but the thing that has been known along those lines is that's what cancer cells do too. So right, so that's the atavistic stuff that Paul Davies and others have worked on. That when you're disconnected from the collective, the rest of the body is just outer environment to you. You're an amoeba again. Right, and so there's a number of scenarios in which that happens. Yeah.
But are you also suggesting that there might be enough affordances that they're trying to look for kind of a new multicellular assemblage to generate?
That's exactly what I think, and obviously much more work on this is needed. But I do think that tumors and biobots and all it's a kind of reboot of multicellularity. You first you go single cell and you roll back, and then again you try your best to assemble in some new functional form, and you make something that is not any stage of normal human development. You have behaviors that are not normal behaviors for any human or human tissue. You have found a new way to be with stock hardware. So one reason why we haven't immediately gone ahead and engineered synthetic circuits into all these things is because I want to know what the default hardware is able to do before we add all this stuff to it. Yeah.
If I've got a factory of well-trained workers doing their jobs and management goes home and never comes back, the system is going to fall apart, and we're gonna lean ever more heavily on the default hardware in an individual person deprived of their collective, right? I wouldn't expect anything constructive to come out of that. It would be interesting and weird, but is the analogy appropriate here?
I think the analogy is appropriate, except that what I think is happening in bodies is multi-level intelligence, and when one level goes home, the bottom levels will do what they can, and they will continue to bend the levels below them. They distort the right. They distort those levels, and what I see in our experiments and others is a constant push of all the levels to make it's a kind of sense making. They're trying to make sense of their world. They're trying to do
Yep.
something that is halfway coherent and adaptive.
Yep.
And when new levels show up above them that will distort their option space, they can be hacked and they will go along. But if those levels aren't there, they will come up with something else. And
Yeah.
that novelty, that push to it's not even just like it's problem solving, yes, but it's not just finding solutions to a problem. It's finding new
Mm.
problems to solve.
Yeah.
And more than that, I think it's finding new spaces in which to find those problems. So if you want, you can get along by solving problems in the anatomical space, or you can ditch that entirely and focus on solving it in metabolic space and being in a unicellular and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I think there's always pressure to do this.
The origin of all metamorphoses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I'll try to get at this again. I don't know. I might be totally just not making any coherent sense here. But in problem solving and the way that you're talking about it, the problem being solved, can I generalize to a sense of saying something like, regeneration or survival or something along those lines? Or is the problem being solved always going to be unique and specific, particular to the, whatever's going on in individual situations? Because
Yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking of is, could I look at a system that rapidly just falls apart and disintegrates as solving a problem in that very action itself? Or is that just incompatible with kind of the way that you're thinking about problem solving?
Yeah. I mean, philosophically, I think what's important here is that everything is from the perspective of some observer. So I don't think there's an objective one answer to what problem is this thing solving or what space does it live in. I think that we are all so we as scientists, but also the parasites, the conspecifics, the parts, the wholes, everybody has some perspective on the problem, and they are all making some kind of model to different degrees of sophistication. They're making some kind of model of what the problem is, what the system's behavior is, which tells them how to hack it. So if you're a parasite or an exploiter of some sort, and also you want to control your own parts, so you need to understand how your own parts work to some extent. They will all have a different view of what the problem actually is. And so, I think for us, we could say that fundamentally that all of this is about persistence or like survival, so bare persistence. I can't disprove it. My gut feeling is that it's a lot more than that. I don't think it's about mere persistence. I think it's about transformation and expansion into new spaces. So I think that's even more fundamental than I think it's more because here's the thing with persistence. In order to I wish I could remember. Maybe you guys know who said this. I don't know whose quote this is, but this paradox where if you try to persist by never changing, you're going to die out when circumstances change. But if you do change and adapt, then you're no longer yourself. So you're also gone because right. So no matter what, you can't persist as an unchanging thing. So I think more fundamental. So I think biology basically bought all into this from the beginning, just realizing that okay, everything is going to change. My parts are going to change. They'll be mutated. The environment changes. We're not going to try to persist anything in particular, which I know this is like not the way that neo-Darwinian kind of thinking is supposed to go. But I think it's way more about change and exploration and expansion into new spaces than it is about persistence of a single thing, identifiably so.
I could be wrong, but if I can track it down, I'll send it to you. I don't think that there's a nice little quote that gets at it, but that's Aristotle identified this problem. He talks about the example of grass. If I can find it, I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I think, no, please go ahead.
Oh, well, I don't know if it's actually entirely shifting gears, but Dan, do you have any follow-ups? I don't want to shift gears.
I've got 3 lunches and 2 dinners worth of follow-ups, but we have limited time, so you go ahead.
Okay. Well, so here's the question that I wanted to ask. I was talking with Justin Garson at the Minnesota meeting, and he has this idea about goal directedness, that it's representational, and that fundamentally, so that any way that you're going to be able to kind of talk about a goal-directed system, it has to be via some sort of representation. And I think for him, that's primarily mental representations.
Yeah.
But I wonder if, in your way of thinking, would you be sympathetic to a view that's so liberal as to think about kind of a morphogenetic field that's doing the directing, in the sense that you're often pointing at, Michael, as a kind of representation? I mean, would something like Justin's thinking here possibly fit? Would you be okay with the idea of representations in that way?
Yeah,
I'm not
absolutely.
doing any justice to Justin's. I mean, I
You are. Sadly, you are.
I think he is kind of committed to a mental representation, but Dan and I were pressing him a little bit, saying, it seems like there are all these developmental processes that don't clearly have representations in the way that you're thinking about them, Justin. But it did definitely make me
Yeah,
want to ask if you think
yeah,
representation characterizes the view,
yeah.
kind of your work.
So here's my view, which he may hate or not. I don't know. Some people think it's worse than the other. I support it, but maybe in a way that they wouldn't like. So here's what I so first of all, about goals in particular, I take a very engineering approach to this, which is I think you're entitled to say something has a goal state when it is the case that an efficient way to manipulate the system's behavior is by altering the goal state as opposed to bottom up rewiring. So the only way I know anything has a goal is if I can tell you where and how that goal is specified, such that I can go in and change it. And now I change the goal. I don't change your hardware. I don't change anything about you, but I change the goal. And if you are now off and running with some degree, and I think this is all a matter of degrees, so I don't think there are binaries here, but if to a useful extent, if I can change the goal with a minimal manipulation, and then you are autonomously off and running to implement that goal, now I think you have goals. If the only way to change what you do is to get in there and I'm the one micromanaging every aspect of your function, I'm rewiring then there's not much goal directness going on here. But if I can do anything from reset your set point, train you on something, give you a coherent argument if you're a human, and now you're off on this thing that I don't need to micromanage, then you've got goals. So that's it. I take a very like practical and engineering approach to this. Now about representation. So we absolutely have examples in for
You just
example.
froze up for me. Both of you froze up. Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Are we back?
You're back. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah,
I
sorry.
lost you. You both froze. Sorry.
Okay. We absolutely have examples in regeneration that I have referred to as representation, and I'll give you and let's keep in mind it's by definition, because this is like very ancient evolutionary stuff. It isn't full-blown human. I know what I know and I know my goals. I'm not talking about second order, metacognition or anything like that. But what does what is a very simple example of representation? Not only representation, but I think counterfactual representation. And here's I'll tell you what you can do. You take a planarian, and it has a particular bioelectrical gradient that tells you how many heads the planarian is supposed to have. And if you cut it into pieces, the pieces consult the pattern and they make exactly how many heads they have. Now, what we can do is we can go ahead and we can alter that pattern within an intact worm. So when you do it within an intact worm, what you have is something very interesting. You have a kind of a schizophrenic situation where the body of the worm is one-headed, but the memory of what a correct worm is supposed to look like actually says two heads. Now, nothing happens until you injure it. So that memory is latent. It is not active. It is just kind of sitting there until you injure the animal. As soon as you injure the animal, the cells consult the pattern. That is ground truth as far as they're concerned. There's nothing else for them to compare to. They make two heads. So what I think is happening here when you're looking at that pattern, I think it's a goal state because it is a suitable control knob for you to set how many heads this thing will autonomously make. I think it is a representation because you can read out in a way that doesn't require you to look at the anatomy or to know what it's you know what the pattern is going to be that guides this behavior. And we have a mapping, at least in this case, if not all cases, between what the memory says and what it's going to do. And I think it's counterfactual because in the case of of these cryptic worms that have that pattern, it is what you are going to do if you get cut in the future. It isn't what's true right now. It is not. It is, and that's what I spend a lot of time on this in my talks because people see the pattern. They go, "Oh, so that's a pattern of the two-headed anatomy." Like this is the pattern of what will happen in the future, and in fact, it might not if you never injure it. So it is not it is not a readout of the current situation. It is I think what it is like an extremely early minimal example of mental time travel. I think this is the kind of thing that later got evolved into our ability to remember things that envision things that are not true right now. It is the ability of the network to hold a state that does not reflect current circumstances, but reflects possible future circumstance. It's minimal. It's not, it's not self-reflective. It's not what. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing I would say is to what you said is this. I think he's kind of right to say that representation is mental, not because you need neurons for this or because it only applies to brains. And this is the part where people leave the train that I'm on. They go, oh, forget it now. Because I say, look, yeah, it's mental, but mental doesn't mean brainy mammals. I really think that the cellular collectives that are solving problems and navigating anatomical space, I think they are a kind of mind. I don't think they're a human mind. I don't think they do everything that brainy minds do, but I think they are a kind of primitive cognitive system. And therefore, I do think that it is not crazy to say that representation is mental, but not mental the way most people take it to mean, which is brainy animals.
I wonder if there's something to say here that wouldn't be interesting, because a possible response to Justin then might be something to the effect of, and I don't know, Dan, what you'll think about this, but say something to the effect of, yeah, Justin, you're right. Maybe goal directedness does rely on representation, and that's what you need for goal-directed states. But Justin, the problem is you have a way too constrained conception of what counts as a mental representation.
Exactly.
You're really committed to this idea of mental representation as being kind of a neural process that has, what we think about mental representations. But if you take a really much more expansive view, like the one you're taking, Michael, then you can get a representational model of goal directedness going.
That's exactly what I would say. And I've had these discussions, we've had neuroscience conferences and things like that. And I'll say, what's a neuron? And I say, neurons. And I'm like, no, really, what's a neuron? And they say, well, it has these properties. And they'll list some properties. They say, every cell in the body does it. They say, well, neural networks, they do this stuff. And say, yeah, all the tissues in your body are doing. They're doing it in a different space. They're not projecting it into three-dimensional space by moving muscles around. That's a newer innovation. But they're doing the same kinds of stuff. And I've argued that a lot of what we study in cognitive science is just a pivot, a speed up, an incredible speed up, of course, but also a pivot of ancient things that were being used to navigate anatomical space that now are like, hey, look, we can use the same tricks to navigate this, this 3D space. So I would say almost all of that kind of stuff holds if you're willing to say that mental doesn't mean human, it doesn't mean brainy, it means some other things as far as perception, action cycles, and problem solving and memory and things like that. And those are extremely ancient.
I think we've got a bad language problem here, and that's my objection to Justin. Everything you guys said is translatable, and most of it was in physical terms. You're not dualists. There's no mind-body separation. You have no notion of symbols, the idea of something, manipulating something physical. Representationalists do. That's the problem. They're computer scientists. And when they're psychiatrists and psychologists, they do. They're really dualists about these things. They think the abstract can affect the physical. Everything you just said is either physical on its face or translatable easily into physicalist terms. But that's not the way that language reads out there in those two worlds, namely, three worlds, AI, computer science generally, and psychology. So I have everything you just said is great. I think it's exactly the wrong language to use out there. But this is, as Gunnar knows, this is a problem area of mine.
Yeah. I would love to. So I think we're going to need another hour on this. I think because I would love
Mm,
to I would love to dig into this because I
yeah.
I understand the reasons to try to avoid the dualist language and all of that. But actually, I think there's a way in which it's really helpful. And I don't
Yeah.
think we should toss it entirely. Like I'm not saying, leave it for metaphorical,
No,
colloquial.
no, no, no.
Like I think
You
there's
want,
real.
yeah, you want the language. You want command of the language, and that's a tack to take. You can say, I know what you mean by mental. I know what I mean by mental. I want to command the scientific social environment to the point where my view of the mental, which is purely physicalist, by the way, is the one that everybody calls to mind. And
Yeah.
if you can succeed at that, more power to you. Yes, pan-mentalism, I get it. Um, but
So
it's a,
I would jump in and say that there is, it's not quite, you don't have to necessarily go the dualist route. I think a lot of people do go the dualist route, but like
yeah, that's the problem.
in the teleosomatic literature, right, you have people trying to make sense of the phenomenal experience of a mental representation, right? So they're physicalists, but they're saying, hey, I have this experience of mental representations. It's this phenomena that you want to make sense of, and you want to say it's important and different somehow. And I think that they're the folks that would want to deny that you get that in the non-brainy stuff. And
Yeah,
I think, but Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're wanting to argue that no, there is a sense that if you kind of talk about that phenomenon in a graded way, it's going to go much lower. That you're going to get something similar at much lower levels. That you don't need the
yep.
the neural framework to be that going at
Yeah, I
all.
mean, yeah, I don't, I don't talk much about consciousness and things like that, but I think, one of the papers that I'm writing now with Nick Rouleau, it takes all the existing theories of consciousness and looks at what it is that they're saying about the brain that is supposed to give rise to this, and pointing out that all of them, without exception, that as far as I can tell, can say the exact same thing about very unconventional systems. And so, yes, I think if you take that stuff seriously, I think it absolutely has to go all the way to the bottom. If you're not
Yep.
looking for human level hopes and dreams and in your paramecium, but you're willing to scale appropriately, I think
Yep.
it goes all the way to the bottom. But I also, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to jump in a couple minutes, but I think we should
Me
do
too.
more on this, Dan, because
Yeah.
and Gunnar, because I think that what you were saying before, I want to push back on that a little bit, and in the sense that I agree with you that we can tell physicalist story, like bottom up physicalist stories, and it's true. After everything we publish, the next thing that happens is somebody says, "Oh, well, I can see how this happens. It's just chemistry." Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, but after the fact, you can tell a chemical story, but inevitably, it's never going to be fairies. It's always chemistry underneath.
Right. So,
But I do think that there's some stuff that you would call dualist that I think is actually worthwhile. So I'd love
okay.
to dig into this more.
Yeah.
I have to go too in a moment, but let me just throw in, you use bottom up and physicalist together like they're a package.
Hmm.
Non-reduction, anti-reductionists like me want to break that package. By
Great,
physicalist, I don't mean bottom up. I
great.
mean top down as well as bottom up.
Okay,
And so
that's
when we
good.
talk about fields or
Yeah,
gradients
yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever causing lower level
yeah,
events, that's
yeah,
physicalist. And if what you want to call, and I could in some moods want to call mental,
yeah,
has downward effects because it's a pre-pattern of some
yeah.
kind of physically instantiated, not reductionistically, but physically instantiated thing with causal powers, yeah, definitely.
Got it.
I'm just worried about fighting too many battles at once.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think that's fantastic. And what I'm really interested in is to get your thoughts on so fields for sure, top down and
Yep.
physicalist.
Yes.
We can get into some other stuff, virtual governors and quasi particles, and I want to know if you're gonna like are those, because you can if they're physical to you, then I think we're good.
Mm,
But I think a lot of people would say, because you can get even weirder, right? So you can get gliders, and you get progressively less physical with this stuff, and I think you keep
mm.
important causality. And so is that still physical? I don't know. I think we need another hour on this.
To be continued.
Yeah. Yeah.